Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, really excited about this morning's panel on sound and race, hearing environments, as well as turning your screens off while the presenters are speaking. Just a reminder to, if it's not already off, to mute yourself as well, so that we don't get any kind of cross feedback. I'm quite likely to have a small boy come in at some point. Enough from me. I'm really thrilled to welcome Wayne Weaver, who in my view is one of the most talented young early modernists in music studies at the moment in the UK. And he's reading for his PhD at the University of Cambridge and working on space, race, and the music of late 18th century Kingston, and which largely focuses on the art and sound worlds of the Anglo-Jamaican composer Samuel Felsted. So we're talking about the latter half of the 18th century. And so looking at colonial period Jamaica and seeing how one might repopulate that history with details of Africans and their descendants whose lives were playing out in theatres, churches, and so forth. Most of his earlier degrees are from the University of Edinburgh, and he's also an organist, and he's at Wolfson College, Cambridge. Over to you, Wayne.
I'll just unmute myself. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Katherine. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, without further ado, I will share my screen and get on with it. There's quite a lot to say as ever. I've packed, as the title suggests, I'm packing quite a lot into this. And as I'll say several times, no doubt, it's very much work in progress. So please bear with me yeah, tell me what you think and feel free to advise. Okay. I think that by now you should all be able to see my screen quite clearly. I'm just going to tweak that slightly because it's ended up slightly too big now. Sorry, bear with me. That's a lot better. Right. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, first slide, please. Yes. Okay, music-related discourse in texts about Jamaica can be split into three categories. Firstly, there are descriptions of musical spaces and what we might call infrastructure. Second, there are accounts of specific musical performances. And thirdly, there are descriptions of social customs involving musical activity. Much of the information known today about the first category, including economic details like the cost of erecting buildings and the salaries of civic musicians such as church organists, can be traced back to the, quote, topographical description of Edward Long's 3-volume History of Jamaica, which he published in London in 1774. Long, who was a noteworthy violinist, was from a wealthy and established family of Jamaican plantation owners. He became extremely important in Jamaica when he moved there, when he traveled there, and held a number of influential posts in the island's administration. His various writings, although controversial, represent one of the most detailed studies of 18th century Jamaica. Brian Edwards, whose History of the West Indies was published in 1793, was influenced by Long and quoted at length. And Brian Edwards quoted at length from his earlier text, excuse me. Sorry. These men, though not Creole by birth, were innately tied to Jamaica through familial ties and inheritance. They spent lengthy residences there and collectively spanned the period 1757 to around 1794. So their texts are key sources for scholars of early modern life in Jamaica. Now, before I begin, I need to make sure that I just mention a brief disclaimer about the terminology I'm going to use in this paper. I do use the word Negro, I do refer to people as being white, black, and biracial. I'm going to talk about two literary genres in particular: history writing and music performance criticism. The latter is with regard to a set of theatre and concert reviews that were printed in Kingston in a periodical in 1788. The reviews are extremely rare and have almost entirely been eaten by insects, as you can see on the current slide. So I'm really pleased to have been able to find these documents very recently and actually be able to read a little bit of what is contained within them. Fortunately, the dates just about fit. And to be honest with you, I think that these sources are really interesting because, as well as shedding light on the music and of the place and the time, they inform on the ways that music-related discourses fed into the construction of quote-unquote race as a type of human difference, which was used as a means of social control in Jamaica. This paper is very much work in progress, and I want to acknowledge the support of Maria Ryan, Mary Caton Lingold, David Irving, and my supervisor, Ben Walton. I will begin with a brief overview now in order to get us orientated within the world, or within the sound world, of late 18th century Kingston. Recorded in the Kingston Vestry Minutes of 1781 is the mandate that the tolling of the, quote, church bell, that is the bell of Kingston Parish Church, be limited to, quote again, no longer than 5 minutes, unless for the funeral of white persons, end quote. Equally notable is that when the Afro-American preacher George Lyle wrote for help to buy a bigger bell for the newly built Kingston Baptist Chapel in the 1780s, and he specified he wanted a bell that could be heard at 2 miles distance, he took care to point out the dual purpose of this bell. The bell was not only intended to summon the faithful, but gave, quote, notice to the owners of slaves that they may know the hour at which we meet and be satisfied that their servants return in due time, end quote. Leal was a loyalist and a free person of colour, supposedly, and as well as being a military trumpeter, Having fought in the American War of Independence, he was evacuated to Jamaica in late 1782. Now, why have I started with these two examples? Well, I'm telling you these things partly to show you that something of the variety of people that were living in Kingston at this time, not all of the Afro-Jamaican population were enslaved. And because I want to show you some examples of how the urban soundscape actually really mattered to 18th century Kingstonians. Unsurprisingly, sounds, musical or otherwise, were tied to concepts and practices marking ethnicity or quote unquote race and social status or class. The importance of race and social place cannot be overstated in the context of colonial era Jamaica. So now to the concert and theatre culture in Kingston. The start of the final quarter of the 18th century saw Revolutionary War wreak havoc and devastation in a number of the British American colonies. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, the so-called jewel in the imperial crown, in the British imperial crown, there was sufficient economic and social stability to support a great flourishing of the performing arts in its urban centres. I'm not saying that Jamaica went unscathed, but as noted by Edward Long, maritime conflicts brought with them a short-term injection of cash into Kingston's local economy, part of which was spent on theatre. But in times of peace, as Long explained, Kingston was not able or disposed to support so costly an amusement. And I'm quoting there from Long's History of Jamaica. Jamaica was a major interchange for the slave trade shipping routes that saw the transportation of goods and people between Britain, America, and the west coast of sub-Saharan Africa. Its thriving sugar plantation economy, built on the brutal enslavement and forced labour of Africans, was what had transformed the island into the richest place in the British Empire by the second half of the 18th century. As the hostilities of the American War of Independence intensified, loyalist refugees and their slaves, together with serving and former military officers, poured into Kingston, the commercial capital. Home to around 14,200 people in 1774, it was already the island's largest settlement. Figures quoted by the contemporary histories of the day suggest that by 1788, Kingston had seen a population increase of at least 12,000. The Kingston musical scene was led in part by musical locals, musicians like Samuel Felsted and Samuel Patch, who were part of a middling white class of artisans, and just occasionally gentlemen residents who occupied a position towards the top of the social hierarchy. Felsted was the organist at Kingston Parish Church, and Patch, who became the organist in Spanish Town, what is now Spanish Town Cathedral, seems to have been the theatre music director in Kingston, or just the theatre musical director in Jamaica at the time, and the theatre travelled around. I've pointed out the locations of some important places on the map on my current slide. Transitory residents like military band musicians and a number of musical refugees also played prominent roles in the organisation of regular concerts and theatrical seasons. As depicted in some of the artwork of the period, people of African and biracial Afro-European heritage also took part in this culture of European or classical art music, for want of a better phrase, in Jamaica. But as the slides, or as the text that I'm going to discuss show, the involvement of Afro-Jamaican quote unquote classical musicians were sometimes subjected to ambivalence, or were typically subjected to ambivalence, ridicule, astonishment, and disbelief by white authors. This seems to have been the case, regardless of whether the Afro-Jamaicans were involved on stage, in the pit, or whether they're involved in the sorts of activities Christopher Small has theorized as musicking. And the images that I'm displaying at the moment are, of course, caricatures. The American Company of Comedians was a troupe of refugee actors and actor-singers who arrived in Jamaica in the months after legislation limiting theatrical activity was passed in the British mainland colonies in late 1774. The company was clearly already well established when, on the 17th of June 1775, they offered a programme of Shakespeare's Hamlet twinned with The Chaplet, a musical entertainment, or a ballad opera to you and I, by William Boyce. Later, on the 1st of July 1775, once the theatre was ready, they offered a performance of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet with additional musical items. The fact that a trip to the theatre in Kingston, I'm sorry, these images are a little bit later than the period in question, but the fact that a trip to the theatre in Kingston typically involved opera is significant. It shows that in Jamaica, considerable effort was being made to promote and to publicly mount forms of musical entertainment that were popular in England and in London in particular. And this can also be seen in the newspapers of the time, which often carried lengthy adverts or advertisements of imported musical items that were on sale at local stationers. Now, there's a lot of text on this slide, so I'm not expecting you to read it all right now. But there's all sorts of musical items here which are for sale, and there's a lot to do with repairing musical instruments as well, or keeping them upkept. Typically, the troupe offered 3 or 4 performances each week with a weekly or bi-weekly change of bill. In these ways, this is the American Company of Comedians. In these ways, a large amount of London's musical and fashionable music, arrived in Jamaica and was being performed on the doorsteps of Kingston's heterogeneous population, a population which, as Colin Clark has pointed out, comprised more slaves and free people of colour combined than all of the urban centres in British North America. When the American Company of Comedians returned to the mainland in the aftermath of the war, they left behind a strong legacy of theatrical culture. There was still significant interest in the theatre, or in theatre, when James Mayhem, another actor, and his wife, an actor-singer or actress-singer, arrived in January 1785. Back in England, Mayhem had been a, quote, favourite and frequent bass singer at Bath and at the Salisbury festivals, and an occasional singer at the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. He had also taken part in the Handel Memorial Concerts of 1786. I end the quote there. Mayhem was the leader or manager of the troupe that was performing in Kingston in 1788. By this time, only 2 actors remained from the American company. Mr. Morales, excuse my Spanish accent, he was probably of Portuguese ancestry, and he was probably from one of Kingston's many families of Iberian Jewish merchants. And there was also a Mr. Roberts, who also came from the American Theatre Company. Okay, moving on now to musical commentary in race and ethnicity. When I started to look for evidence of what 18th century white Jamaicans wrote about their concert and theatre culture, albeit borrowed from the metropole, I was surprised to find a rather lopsided focus in all of the history books. Instead of providing details of Jamaica's European music scene, what Long Edwards and others offered is a sort of outsider commentary on Afro-Jamaican musical customs. only long published a significant amount of detail about the European musical activities, as I mentioned at the start of this paper. The following excerpt, was written by Brian Edwards and is typical of how he and Long wrote about Jamaican musical customs. I've highlighted the phrases, and there are several that are derogatory in some way, generally, or are important. And so I'm going to read a lot of this out, actually. But yeah, a lot of it is derogatory of people of African heritage. Of those imitative arts in which perfection can be attained only in an improved state of society, it is natural to suppose that the Negroes have but little knowledge. An opinion prevails in Europe that they possess organs peculiarly adapted to the science of music. But this, I believe, is an ill-founded idea. In vocal harmony, they display neither variety nor compass. As practical musicians, some of them, by great labour and careful instruction, become sufficiently expert to bear an underpart in a public concert. But I do not recollect, ever to have seen or heard of a Negro who could truly be called a fine performer in any capital instrument. They prefer loud continued noise to the finest harmony and frequently consume the whole night in beating on a board with a stick. From such instruments, nothing like a regular tune can be expected, nor is it attempted. Their songs are commonly impromptu, and there are among them individuals who resemble the improvisatore or extempore bards of Italy. But I cannot say much for their poetry. Their tunes in general are characteristic of their national manners, those of the Igbos being soft and laughing, of the Coromantins heroic and martial. At the same time, there is observable in most of them a predominant melancholy, which to a man of feeling is sometimes very affecting. Now, there's lots of things to pick up on in this text, and there isn't time to go through it, bit by bit. That's for the thesis. But I would like to point out how Brian Edwards actually showed himself to be very much out of touch with the fashionable music scene in England at the time. He completely fails here to recognise George Bridgetower, a friend of Beethoven and a prolific musician in his own right. Bridgetower had dazzled concert audiences in London, Bath and Bristol in 1789 and was, by the time that Edwards' history went to print, a royal musician under the patronage of the future George IV. All of this was reported in the London Intelligence of the day, and I really struggled to wonder at how this was not reported in Jamaican newspapers at the time, because there's lengthy correspondence from London in all of the issues. Anyway, in order to understand why the music of Jamaica has been documented in this way, it is important to think about the wider implications and meanings of these texts. It might be more helpful to think about what Jamaica's 18th century white Creoles might have believed they stood to gain or lose by documenting the island's European culture. Authors like Long and Edwards wrote to the intensifying rhetoric of abolitionists like William Wilberforce. They hoped, and in some ways succeeded, to portray an image of a happy and prosperous Jamaica with a supposedly subordinate and benevolent population of free and enslaved Africans. The fact that both Long and Edwards chose to call their monographs a history is significant. Kathleen Wilson has explained that the late 18th century history had emerged in the 1750s as a primary vehicle for national self-understanding and identity, as well as philosophical reflection. History writing promoted a cosmopolitan perspective and a deeply grounded sense of national specificity. Jamaica's 18th century musical discourse fits into the climate of Enlightenment era narrative in which authors attempted to categorize, mediate, and explain that unfamiliar and growing imperial world. There was a gradual change in thinking about ethnicity around this time, which resulted in the birth of the concept race, which, as we know, has persisted in scientific and popular thought. As Barry Higman has explained, the idea of race persisted in spite of the absence of any agreement on the number of races that existed or on how individuals should be allocated to them. Only in the later 20th century, with the identification of the gene and DNA, did the concept of race come finally to be rejected as unfounded in biology. That's the end of the quote there. Recent events across the globe has reminded me, and no doubt all of us, how much race, albeit understood today as a social construct, still matters. As pointed out by Bill Ashcroft and others, in order to construct the self, 18th century writers turned to the delimitation of the other. And the other, of course, is the term that has been theorized by Gertrude Spivak to describe the process by which imperial discourse created its colonized subjects. Strategies of othering link closely with the methods of subjugation and alienation 18th century authors used to enforce stereotypes about individuals and groups of people who could be found to be simply different in some way. In the context of 18th century Jamaican music commentaries, I regard othering as a sort of umbrella term that encompasses a number of recurring literary strategies of Black subjugation. 18th century musical commentary is bound up in attempts to explain these likenesses and differences in people, but also to explain, and particularly to explain social and behavioral customs and values. A musical literature, as much as any other topic of writing, I've found, can be seen to form part of a highly pervasive system of social control when it's viewed in the context of colonial era Jamaica. My reading of these texts has led me to believe that people of African heritage living in Jamaica were presented as the exponents of an inferior musical culture because they were believed to be inferior themselves. Afro-Jamaicans were supposedly content with their lot in life and supposedly sang and danced in demonstration of their merriments. Now, like many of the first readers of these texts, we all know that nothing could be further from the truth. And although nothing on the scale of the Haitian Revolution happened in Jamaica, uprisings and revolts and other forms of resistance like running away happened frequently. There was an uprising in Hanover in 1776, and there were various rebellions that led to the passing of the Slavery Emancipation Act in 1833. Now, sadly, there isn't time for me to talk about the few instances where authors, well, where an author in particular might have been presenting an alternative view about Afro-Jamaican musical activities. Instead, I want to show you some examples of from the Jamaica Gazette of 1788, which demonstrate how European musical activity was being written about in material intended for the consumption of the white Jamaican public. Okay, so on the 23rd of July here, we have The Agreeable Surprise and The Padlock being performed. These are two ballad operas, and it went wrong. On Saturday last, Mr. Mayhem made a second attempt to entertain the community in the line of a theatrical fate. The surprise was totally lost. It's called The Agreeable Surprise. It's supposed to be a big moment. It was totally lost. The music was wretched. The leading gentleman seemed a foreigner. On the flute, he seems to possess ability, but we cannot recommend him as a leader. And then this rather interesting phrase at the end: the heads of Negroes may be of use to their owners, but can be no ornament to his senses. Now, I will come back to this briefly at the very end. Then on August the 6th, the next review is a lot more positive, although the gallery was half full. You can see that the performance is described as having considerable vivacity and judgment, fine judgment, and it was applauded. Then moving on to August the 16th in 1788, a benefit concert for Monsieur de Solomon's. This was a positive event, actually. So it was described as lively and charming in terms of the music of Van Hal. And we get this phrase of the delighting every votary of Apollo. This comes up time and time again. The Flute Concerto by Monsieur Solomon was an admirable specimen of the surprising powers of harmonious sounds and riveted the attention of the company to a very extraordinary degree. The Periodical Overture, and I think this is a work by Haydn, excuse my ignorance if I'm not getting that right, was bewitchingly executed. Interesting spelling there, but that's how they wrote it. The next event is really important now. This is November the 8th, 1788, and it's Samuel Patch and Samuel Felsted and a concert of sacred music that they put on at Kingston Parish Church. It's described as a performance which could be called a feast of music and delighted every votary of Apollo. The overture from the occasional oratorio by Handel arrested universal attention and thrilled the souls of the audience with unspeakable ecstasy. Mrs. Mayhem, that's the wife of Mr. Mayhem, the actor, sang the divine song of "Oh, Had I Jubal's Lie" in a most charming manner. The song of "Rise Up, My Love" by a gentleman was also given with great feeling and melody. The band consisted of near 70 vocal and instrumental performers, amateurs and professionals. And although you can't read the text because it's been eaten, it goes on to refer to decorum, solemnity, and harmony. So, to end now, considered collectively, the mixed picture of success that these reviews present is probably accurate. Inevitably, there were times when things did not run smoothly. and the scathing remark which ended the first critique I've shown you about the heads of people of African origin, it perhaps shows a little of what the reviewer felt was at stake here, and perhaps explains why historic sources seem to be so contrived. Performances of European music had to be of the highest caliber, not just to entice large audiences, but because poor quality performances might draw comparisons with the inferior customs and behaviours of the Afro-Jamaican population. In order for white Jamaicans to feel that they were in total control of the black population, their musical customs largely went unquestioned, and its superiority, or the superiority of these customs, had to be assumed because musical activities rather, are bound to concepts of behaviour, custom and taste. However, despite attempts to deny servants and slaves entry to theatrical performances and certain concerts, which you might have spotted in one of my previous slides, a hybrid culture was developing in the Afro-Jamaican community, and expressions like John Connor and the set girl tradition demonstrate how, irrespective of what white residents were writing, Afro-Jamaicans were doing their own seeing and hearing, and their own knowing and interpreting. By employing a writer or writers of musical and theatrical critiques, the managers of the Jamaica Gazette clearly perceived that Kingston's musical culture was in need of elevation sometimes, and that music criticism had a part to play in this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I particularly love the worm-eaten sources, which I also have to deal with from this period. It's a lot of fun trying to interpret them. We pass now straight over to Una McIlvenna. Is that how you pronounce your name? I'm sorry.
Una.
Yeah. Who joins us from the University of Melbourne, where she is Hanson Senior Lecturer in History, and she's published widely on execution ballads and the tradition of singing the news in Past and Present, Renaissance Studies, Media History, and Huntington Library Quarterly. And her book, Singing the News of Death, Execution Ballads in Europe 1500 to 1900, will appear this year with OUP, which is very exciting. So welcome, and of course we'll give you time to set up and so forth. But we're really looking forward to this edition.
Thanks, Katherine, and it's nice to finally meet you in person rather than just in social media. Yeah. I'm gonna just quickly share my screen and play from the start. And now hopefully you can see that and hear me okay. Yes, so I have just finished a book on execution ballads, which is with the copy editor now, very exciting. And so I devoted a section in that because I'm very interested in how these ballads were sold in the early modern community on the streets. And I work right through the 19th century, in fact, into the early 20th century, because they were still being sold then. So I'm just gonna change my view. Okay, that's it. So they were sold, of course, by street singers. So if you're not familiar with early modern ballads, street singers were a ubiquitous sight on the streets and marketplaces of early modern Europe, armed with cheaply printed song sheets or small song books. They'd sing the contents of the songs as a means of advertising their wares. The usual business model, there's some variation, but the usual model is that the sellers would buy the song sheets and song books from the publishers, the printers, and then they would hawk them in the streets to try and recoup their costs. Now, all singers, to recoup their costs, chose the busiest places they could find to sell their wares. So they're busy street corners, bridges, this man here is sitting on the Pont Neuf, marketplaces and fairs, and they often use small benches or trestles, you see them here, in order to be seen and heard better. So that's where we get the German name Bänkelsänger and the Italian name Cantimbanco, which both mean bench singer. It's just standing on the bench. So street singers usually occupied a kind of liminal, usually itinerant, and sometimes even criminal status. The songs that they sold often began with what folklorists call a come all ye incipit. So that's an opening expression that invites people close by to gather around and listen. And you can see them here gathering around. It's often directed at a certain group. Come all ye young maidens, approchez-vous, hommes, filles et femmes, kommt all her zu Christen Leute, you know, everyone come by and listen. So once people had gathered around, they could buy the song sheets And because songs were in most European languages set to a familiar tune, they could immediately sing along and join in the street singer with the street singer. Now, there was just recently, 2019, a Renaissance Studies special issue on street singers, which covers Italy, Spain, England, the Low Countries, and mine on France. So I'm not going to rehash that. If you want to read that and you haven't got access, then just let me know and I can send you the PDF. But importantly, the contributor that was going to contribute on the German lands wasn't able to in the end. And I think that's an important gap, because what I want to argue today is that had the German lands been included, there would have been far more focus on the particular aspect of the street singer that I want to focus on today, and that's that oil painting there. A key element in the performance of song in certain regions was this portable oil painting, which had usually several images painted on it. Now, the images depict certain moments in the song's narrative, but they're usually out of chronological order. So you need the street singer to point to each image with a long stick. You see, I don't know if you can make that out there, that stick that he's got there, to explain how the story unfolds. So street singers would travel with these big oil paintings rolled up, and they'd use them in tandem with the song sheets that they would sell. Indeed, in the Low Countries, the term Scrollsanger, singer of the scroll, refers specifically to that rolled up painting. So I want to interrogate what exactly the relationship was between the use of those paintings and the singing and selling of songs. And I've kind of approached it with the basic questions, you know, who, what, where, when, why, how. Some of those are easier to answer than others. So who were street singers? We've done a lot of work to try and identify them. Who watched and listened to them? We'll see that seems pretty easy. When did the tradition begin? That's harder. That's the question that I'm starting to answer, because this is also a work in progress. And where does it appear? And again, that's kind of hard, because I'm relying a lot on pictorial evidence, and we're going to see a lot of pictures today. But I think we do have some first-hand accounts as well that I'm going to use, and I'm aware that I'm speaking to a Soundscapes conference about paintings, which might seem not appropriate initially, but what I ultimately want to argue is that hearing the news being sung in the early modern urban environment was a multi-sensory, multimedia experience. And I have a whole bunch of questions that as I'm kind of starting this, this is one of those things that's just been sitting in the back of my mind for a long time. Where was this use of oil paintings a common sight? We're going to see that it's not being used in Britain, definitely in the German lands, some parts of Italy, some parts of Eastern France. Is it the Low Countries? It's hard to tell. How widespread was it? Why was it popular in certain regions and not in others? And we know that it continues into the 20th century in both Germany and Italy, but did it exist in other places before then? How did it work in practice? From what I can gather from the pictorial evidence, street singers are working in pairs or in families, with usually the husband singing and the wife, and he's pointing to the painting, and the wife or children is selling the sheets. Was that standard practice? We'll have to see. Why would someone buy the song sheets if they could just listen? Again, we have a little bit of evidence for that. Are people actually singing along? Are they just listening? What do they do when they take it home? That's a bit harder. We have evidence that people are pasting some of these song sheets up in their homes, on the chimneys and on alehouses and walls and things. But what about if they're small chapbooks, which are really, really common on the continent, not so much in Britain? How did the street singer perform and sell the chapbooks that contain those multiple songs? That's a standard printing format in the German lands, for example. So that's a really interesting question around performance. How do we know which songs were sung? Which ones did they choose? And how did the paintings work in conjunction with broadsides that featured multiple images in vignette form? And I'm going to come back and show you some images of those. So was the painting merely a prop to make this a bit of a show, a performance? Was it tied in specifically to the song's message? Again, when we look more at the paintings, I think we'll be able to answer that. How does the performance using an oil painting relate to news, which is always a really hard question to ask. What do we mean by news? Is this topical? All these songs, or lots of the songs, claim to be a new account of something. How new is it if you've got an oil painting already prepared that you're pointing to? If we think about censorship and rules, how much is this, attempts to avoid censorship, which are different in different regions, resulting in a limited choice of subject matter for that oil painting? We're going to see a lot of similar things coming up again and again. Which came first, the painting or the song? Good question. I think it's the painting. And what was it like to experience news delivered in this way? What was it like to stand and listen to someone sing and point to an oil painting? So first of all, I think we need to have a look at what songs look like, the product that they're selling. These are English ones. The one on the left is a 16th century song sheet. There's very little imagery on it. No real woodcuts apart from a tiny decoration at the bottom. That's standard. By the 17th century, you're expecting to see at least one or two woodcuts, sometimes more. They're usually very simplistic, but that's what you expect. The tune is often not specified in the 16th century ones, but it's nearly always suggested in the 17th century ones. Doesn't much change over time. We get to the 19th century and this is what they look like. You might get two on the same sheet, two songs, but you still expect to see that basic woodcut very often at the top of those slip sheets. Italian ones, sometimes you get a nice kind of custom-made woodcut, but that's because this is a song about a really important guy being assassinated. What you're more likely to get is a chapbook like this with just not a proper illustration, just a kind of a frontispiece, because this is just a regular woman. In Dutch, similar again, you get either these long little slip songs with the tune at the top. They are being then combined, this is by the 17th century, into songbooks in which they're all put together in landscape format. French are the most diverse in terms of printing. You can get single sheet songs, sometimes printed recto and verso, like this one. You can get broadsides with a picture at the top. And you can also get, from the 16th century onwards, these song books, recueil, collections of songs with hundreds of songs, sometimes on a variation of a variety of topics. When we come to German, you can get a variety as well. We get some of these sort of simplistic woodcuts sometimes at the top of a broadsheet. You're more likely to see in the early modern period these chapbooks with several songs, sometimes about 3 to 4, with each one has its own tune that's underlined there, as you can see. But these are the ones I want to focus on because I think there's a link between this kind of broadsheet production and the oil painting, because these are songs about gruesome events. This guy's murdering his whole family. The vignettes here, in a sort of a comic strip style storytelling, are going on. Sometimes they're even colored. They're really, really sophisticated. They're really advanced. And I think that there's definitely some sort of link between these and the oil paintings that come, because this is what I'm interested in. If you look at these oil paintings, are nearly always multiple images in a mixed up format. So what we want to think about though is, when does this appear? Because as I've gone back through all of the images I have of people selling music in the street, very few of them in the early modern period, if we think about the 16th, 17th century, feature these oil paintings. This is, 15th century Venice. Here we have the Commedia dell'arte here performing, and then in the background you've got those musical performers, but no oil painting. So they're up on a trestle, you can see them, but no painting. You're more likely to see singers like this. And on the left is France, on the right is England, people selling single sheets, and you can see the poverty that they manifest there. So he's selling 12 different sheets for £1. These are English ones, a couple of Hogarths here. Again, the poverty-stricken ballad seller here and here. This woman is breastfeeding while she's selling her song. This man, by the 18th century, has managed to get a little stool to stand on, but still very much this idea of selling sheets. This is a Dutch from the mid-17th century, and he is, he's on a bridge. Bridges are good bottlenecks. You've got lots of people there, and there's a little place he can stand, and it looks like it's a husband and wife. But again, no oil painting. They're simply selling the song sheets. This is France, about 1700. This is one of the Cris de Paris series of street sellers, ambulant vendors, of which street singers are a very obvious one. They appear regularly. And here, it's these guys here who I've enlarged, and you see them standing on their little trestle table, two of them with a violin accompaniment and the song sheets. And here's another one from a different Cris de Paris, but again, you see the same thing, song sheets, but no painting. But it's at this point that we start to see evidence in various places. So here's some textual evidence. This man Wegener argues he's attacking superstitions in 1735, and he says there's no doubt that stories like these have been learned from the vagabonds who travel from market to market and recite all sorts of murder stories, the better to sell their printed songs telling these stories, and who even go further and have with them paintings of such shocking stories, and while reciting, point at them with a stick in order that the simple people may be more inclined to believe them. So by 1735, he's already very aware of this tradition that's been going on clearly for some time. But this is the earliest image I have of such a painting. It's very hard to date these images, and you have to generally try and find out when the printer was around or the engraver or whatever. But here we have a very satirical depiction of street singers. They are poor. He is disabled. That's another very common trope around street singers. And they're pointing to what looks like a bit of a dirty picture. So it's a bit of a joke, this one. They look like a husband and wife. We're going to see that a lot. They have one image on their painting, which I think is interesting. He is singing, again, usually that's it. He sings and points at the picture, and she is the one selling the sheets. But the poverty is very obvious. Goethe wrote a fictional account. He was quite fascinated with Winkelsingers, and he talks about a couple like that setting up their show in a court masque in 1773. And they say the bench singer comes with his wife and sets up his picture. And I think that's interesting that he is the singer and she is the wife who helps. And the people gather around, and there's a sort of moralizing purpose for what they do. You dear Christians, when will you improve yourselves? There is no other way of finding peace and enlarging your good fortune. Vice hurts a man. So this kind of idea that the street singer will sell you a moral tale, which I think is quite common. So I'm going to show you a bunch of images of these oil paintings, and I've tried to put them in sort of chronological order to see if we could see some kind of development of them. Again, hard to date, but this one's maybe a little bit easier, because what Hans Pumsack and his musikalische Weibe, musical wife, are singing about is the execution, the mass executions in Paris in 1721 of the infamous Robert Outlaw Cartouche and his gang. And so we could probably date this to somewhere close to that. So this is the idea that street singers are singing a really, really high profile execution song. And we're going to see that importance of execution again and again. So again, they're on their trestle table, they look quite poor, and he is pointing to the song. Around about the same time, we have a painting by Trautmann, who is, I'm dating the picture according to when he was alive. They're in the town square, the family are there on their trestle, the wife is sitting on the barrel, the father's pointing to the painting, and it's hard to pick out what's on the painting itself, 6 images, but there looks like a comet and maybe a cross there on this panel here. So we're talking about, there's always some kind of religious aspect to these paintings, and very often some kind of wondrous thing. So a comet fits that bill. Then we go to Venice. So all the ones I've shown up to this point have been German. Now we have some from Venice. So slight differences. We have a lone singer in a chair. No one seems to be helping him. He's got a guitar over his shoulder. He's pointing to the painting, which has multiple images, a great big central one, and then a bunch of smaller ones around. The song sheets, I'm assuming these song sheets in the basket. I'm not sure if this lady is helping them sing. I don't know what's going on here. But the use of song sheets in Italy is an interesting one that I'm going to come back to. Another German one around the same time, 1740. He's on a trestle with holding the song sheets in his hand, and he's singing and pointing. And we see multiple images on here. I don't know if you can pick this out, but I can always pick out there's someone being executed here. So nearly always features a panel of someone being executed. I don't know what the rat catcher is signifying here, but note the people gathered around and their obvious poverty. but that idea that there's always a crowd around these people, they attract them easily. Another German one, roughly the same time. This one is good because the close-up of the painting, you can actually get quite a bit of detail about what is on there. So this looks like some kind of monster. I'm not sure if this is some sort of angels or some sex thing going on. There's a war, maybe a siege of a city, wonders in the sky, and of course, someone being beheaded. So we get a sense of the kind of things that are being combined on these paintings. The verses are mocking how badly they sing, and that's another kind of satire that we see of singers a lot. This one might be Dutch. It's harder to find the details. The painter's unknown, but here again we have the male singer pointing. These men seem to be helping him hold up his pole. I'm not sure if this musician is part of the group with the fiddle. There are 9 images on the painting. There's this little paper stuff on the front. I don't know what for. Is that the song sheet that he's trying to sell? Here's a male listener in the foreground who seems to have a song sheet. Is he joining in? It is likely. Now the German one, again, mid-18th century, again, really stressing, I think, the poverty of the listeners here. Again, the execution scene here, as well as what seem like cosmic things flying in the sky. There's always sort of wonders. This is Bohemia. Norbert Grund is a Bohemian in their sort of Czech area. The husband and wife team here are on their trestle. There's 8 images here. Again, she's selling, he's pointing. This is a Breton picture. This is kind of an interesting one because we have a male singer here. He's selling small songbooks out of his bag. He's pointing to the painting. He's got one in his hand that he's selling, a little book. There's multiple images as always, but it's only men around him. The women are all over here looking at another painting, which seems to be of the Madonna del Carmine, who I'll come back to. Now, Louis Sebastian Mercier, who was a diarist living in Paris, was really great in terms of describing what he could see. He says there's 2 kinds of street singers. And he said one kind is a holy one. The other one is singing bawdy songs. Often they're very close together, only 40 paces away. One, the religious one, is offering you a blessed scapular. So he's selling products as well that will chase away the devil. In a red suit in his painting with a tail that swishes. So the painting is of the devil. The other celebrates the famous victory. We saw that on some of those paintings. All of this is placed in the rank of miracles. And then there's a description of how it's hard to concentrate and who is being drawn away to the other song. The happy song makes the audience desert the seller of scapulars. And he remains alone on his footstool, pointing in vain with his stick at the horns of the tempting devil. So this idea that there's multiple guys selling different kinds of songs. And here's that religious seller singing about the most famous execution of all, of course, Jesus Christ, with a crowd below. And there's all kinds of activity going on here as well. People being press ganged into going to battle. This is a Dutch one about, we could date it because the painting is celebrating here the Dutch victory of Admiral Zoutman in the Battle of Doggerbank in 1781. So this is the late 18th century. Again, the people standing around. Another Dutch one, the Rollenzanger Lange Jan, so the Long John, the scroll singer. So he's singing here in Rotterdam with the statue of Erasmus. We're getting towards the end of the 18th century, another German one, which we've seen before. Here's the family helping out, the children on the trestle, and lots of different things, flying monsters in the sky. Venice again, and once again, this guy is selling by himself. He's got a guitar, some kind of guitar-like instrument. 24 images on this painting. It's massive, but no visible song sheets that I can pick out. So that's something I see again and again in Italian paintings. Again, a similar one with this guy here, lone guitar, multiple images, no song sheets. And then this is probably Belgium or Netherlands, a male singer with a male musical accompaniment on the fiddle. This is interesting because the German one, he's got, we've got a family group again helping out, but the picture here is of the earthquake of Basel in 1356. And then these ones, the floods in 1830. So this is recent news. This is very old news, but I'd argue that they're trying to bring these 2 events together to show you what happens when you don't follow the moralizing message in songs. This is a caricature about Napoleon, and then a French one. He's up on a plinth. I'm not sure if that woman is helping him sing or not. The Italian one is the Cantastorie. There's that Madonna del Carmine again. But again, the poverty both of sellers and singers. And then the German one, and I think this is interesting because it's he's accompanied by the organ grinder, but look at the reaction of people to the painting. Goethe would argue that the bench singers' large pictures made a far deeper impression than their songs. And he said there was a thing called the Winkelsingerblick, which sees nothing in the world but adventure, capital punishment, love, murder, and slaughter, just as it's all pictured in the squares of this painted canvas. And there's one in Eastern France. So this is showing how far it's traveling. And here's some Flemish folklore by the 20th century. They're remembering the Rollzanger. So I just want to show that picture because that's a picture from the backside. So this lasts right into the 20th century. And here we have the Germany's last Winkelsinger in the 1930s. What was it like to see one of these guys or to watch him? This is a 19th century first-hand account of a man singing a song in Nevers. All eyes were fixed on the immense painted canvas fixed on top of a picture divided into the different scenes of the drama, which the art of the signwriter had depicted in all the most garish colours. A roll on the drum, a short patter, and then were sung the sinister verses in the most theatrical of voices, invariably to the tune known as Froidez. Wham! With a thwack of his baton against the canvas, which dripped with horror, the showman punctuated the end of each verse, which described one episode of the drama illustrated in the picture, as if to affirm the veracity of the story. The song, a long page of emotional outpourings written in the most lachrymose style and illustrated in lively colours, only cost 10 centimes, so customers abounded. So street singers and song are everywhere. There's way more pictures I could show you, but I think the street singer is chosen as a central subject in order to depict a range of common folk that otherwise might not get depicted. We've seen that he can always draw a crowd. It's always a busy, bustling scene around the street singer, and therefore singing here is a communal practice. The use of musical accompaniment varies depending on which region you're from, nearly always absent in Britain. There's a diversity in the printed formats of songs, which I think is echoed in the diversity of selling practices, and that portable oil painting seems to be limited to the German lands, the Low Countries, Eastern France, and Northern Italy, where somehow there seems to be no song sheets in Italy. It seems to start in the early 18th century. We're going to see. And I think that those multiple vignettes echo the broadside format of early German printing. There's a regular depiction of poverty and disability, so therefore buying the song sheets, I think, is also a mark of charity. The combination of things, of religious justice, civil justice, and drama makes it the shocking ballad picture show, which is what Tom Cheeseman called it a long time ago. How much of it's actually news, I don't know, but I want to argue that street singing was a multi-sensory, multimedia, highly emotional experience. So we're looking at something that's more than simply a soundscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Una. That was wonderful. So we've just had two absolutely wonderful presentations that do seem to have multiple connections